My MIL booked a family cruise for everyone except me, so I showed up in the Caribbean on my family's mega yacht. Now she's begging for an invite. My mother-in-law Diane announced the family cruise at Sunday dinner. I've booked us all on a 7-day Caribbean cruise for Christmas. She pulled out printed tickets and started handing them out. One for my husband Brett, one for his sister Amy, one for Amy's husband, one for Brett's brother, one for his brother's girlfriend who'd been dating him for 3 months. Then she sat back down. I waited. What about mine? I asked. Diane looked confused. Oh, I figured you'd want to spend Christmas with your own family. You're always talking about them. I hadn't mentioned my family in months. Brett just sat there eating his potatoes. But I'm Brett's wife. We've been married 4 years. Diane shrugged. Well, the rooms are already booked. It's 5 people, and the ship doesn't allow 6 to a suite. You understand? The girlfriend who'd been around 3 months was going. I wasn't. This wasn't new. Diane had been doing this for years. The family reunion in Vegas, the hotel room blocks filled up. The weekend at the lake house we assumed you were working. The wine tasting tour. It's really more of a blood family thing. But a cruise was different. A whole week watching my husband leave for a vacation I wasn't invited on. Brett tried smoothing it over in the car. Maybe we can book you a ticket separately. You could get a room on a different floor. I asked if he was seriously suggesting I book myself onto a cruise where his entire family already had rooms together. What else can we do? She already paid, he said. What he could do was obvious. He just wasn't going to do it. That's when I called my father. My family had money, real money. The kind where the boats have names and there are houses in more than one country. I'd never flaunted it, because I loved Brett for who he was, not what he had. But Diane had pushed too far. Dad, I said, I need to charter the Mariana for Christmas week, the big one. He didn't even ask why. Done. Where to? I told him the Caribbean, specifically the same ports the cruise was hitting. He laughed. Someone exclude you from something? He knew me too well. The next Sunday dinner, Diane was still going on about the cruise, showing photos of the ship, talking about the dining room, the activities. Such a shame you can't come, she said to me, but you'll have a nice quiet Christmas here. I smiled. Actually, I won't be here. My family's doing something that week too. Diane barely looked up. That's nice. A little local get-together. I pulled out my phone and showed them the yacht 180 feet of pure luxury. We're taking this to the Caribbean. Same ports as your cruise, actually. What a coincidence. Brett dropped his fork. Amy leaned in for a closer look. Is that a yacht? Like a private yacht? I nodded. It's one of ours. Full crew, chef, everything. My parents, my siblings, their kids, were even bringing my cousin's new boyfriend. Family's family, you know. Diane's face cycled through several expressions. That must cost a fortune. I shrugged. Dad owns it. No real cost, just fuel and crew. Brett suddenly perked up. Maybe I could skip the cruise and come with you instead. I laughed. Oh no, you already have plans. Besides, it's really more of a blood family thing. You understand. Diane tried to recover. Well, cruise ships have so many more activities, casinos, shows, multiple restaurants. I kept scrolling through photos. True. We just have the jet skis, the submarine, the helicopter for island hopping. Pretty boring compared to a cruise ship. Amy's husband was staring. Did you say submarine? The best part was still coming. Oh, and since we'll be in the same ports, maybe we'll see each other. We could wave from the yacht while what deck are you on again? Interior rooms. We have balcony rooms, I said, pretending to think it over. Right? Those little balconies on the side, you'll be able to see us perfectly. The yacht usually has to anchor away from the cruise ships. We need more space. Brett was panic texting me under the table. Please, let me come. Please. I didn't know you were doing this. I ignored him and kept talking. My brother's girlfriend is so excited. She's only been dating him for a month, but family's family, right, Diane? The week of the cruise came, and my family and I boarded the Mariana 2 days before they left, making sure to post nothing online until we were already at sea. Then I started sharing photos, breakfast spread across the deck, sunset from the hot tub, my mom and I doing yoga on the helipad. Brett called from their first port. We can see your yacht from the ship. It's enormous. He sounded miserable. Everyone keeps asking about it. The captain even announced it over the speaker. I was getting a massage on the deck at the time. How fun. How's your cruise? I could hear Diane in the background asking if that was me. Brett said something muffled. Mom wants to know if she can come see the yacht. I told Brett to put her on speaker. Sure, Diane can come see the yacht. We'll be docked at Marina Bay tomorrow afternoon around 2. Just take a water taxi from the cruise port. Brett's voice lightened, almost happy. Really? That's great. Thank you so much. I could hear Diane in the background remarking on how nice that was of me. I hung up and walked over to where my brother was doing tricks on the jet ski near the yacht. Guess who's coming to visit tomorrow? He cut the engine and floated closer. Please tell me it's your mother-in-law. I nodded, and he started laughing so hard he nearly fell in the water. My dad, reading up on the upper deck, looked up at the noise. What's so funny? My brother called up. She invited Diane to come see the yacht. He set his book down and came to the railing. Are you sure that's a good idea? I shrugged, but something in his tone made me pause. What did I actually want out of letting Diane visit? Was I trying to rub her nose in what she'd excluded me from? Did I want an apology? Did I just want her to see I had a family that actually wanted me around? I didn't have a clear answer, and that bothered me more than I expected. That evening, my mom found me on the main deck watching the sunset. She sat beside me quietly for a minute, then asked what I really wanted out of all this. I admitted I didn't know. Part of me wanted Diane to apologize and understand what she'd done wrong. Part of me just wanted her to see exactly what she'd excluded me from and feel bad about it. Part of me wanted to prove I didn't need her family's approval, because I had my own. My mom said those were all valid, but I should figure out which one actually mattered before Diane showed up, or I might do something I'd regret. I told her I'd think about it. Honestly, I still didn't know. I couldn't sleep that night. Brett kept texting, each message more desperate than the last. Everyone on the cruise was talking about the yacht. His mom was embarrassed because people kept asking her about it. Amy and Jeremy were uncomfortable. The whole family dynamic felt off now. Then the text that really got to me. You've made your point. When are you coming home? Like this whole trip was just me punishing him instead of actually enjoying time with my own family. Like I'd planned a yacht trip purely to make him feel bad, and not because his mother had excluded me from a family vacation. I put my phone on silent and lay there thinking about what my mom had asked. What did I really want? The next afternoon, I was on the upper deck when I saw the water taxi approaching. Diane sat in front, dressed in what looked like her nicest cruise outfit, flowered dress, sandals, sun, hat. As the taxi got closer and she got a good look at the Mariana, I watched her face change. Her mouth opened slightly. She gripped the side of the boat. The yacht towered over the little taxi. When she stepped onto our dock, she had to crane her neck up and up to see the top decks. She looked small, standing there next to it, almost like a kid seeing something overwhelming for the first time. I walked down to meet her, keeping my voice polite but not warm. "Welcome aboard. Let me show you around." She followed me up the stairs, hesitating with every step. My family was having lunch at the big table on deck. Fresh fruit and pastries spread everywhere. My mom stood and walked over, hand extended. "You must be Diane. It's so nice to finally meet you." Perfectly gracious, perfectly polite, and somehow more cutting than if she'd been rude, like she was demonstrating exactly how family is supposed to treat family. Diane shook her hand and tried making conversation, talking up the cruise ship, how many restaurants it had, the nightly shows, the casino, the pools, comparing everything favorably to the yacht, like she was trying to convince herself. Then she looked past my mom and spotted our chef working on fresh lobster, wine chilling in ice buckets, real china, and crystal on the table. She stopped mid-sentence, just stood there, watching the setup, and I could see her realize everything she just said was obviously wrong. The yacht won on every front, and she knew it. She went quiet after that and just trailed behind me as I gave the tour. I showed her the hot tub on the side deck, the jet skis at the back, the helicopter on the upper pad. With each stop, Diane got smaller and quieter. Stopped trying to justify the cruise or draw comparisons, just walked behind me silently, nodding at whatever I pointed out. I started feeling less satisfied with each stop. I'd wanted her to see what she'd excluded me from, but watching her get this visibly humiliated wasn't as good as I'd expected. It just felt uncomfortable, a little mean, like kicking someone already down. My dad must have noticed, because he came over and started making easy conversation with Diane, asked about the cruise, how Brett's family was enjoying it, about her other kids and what they did for work. His voice was genuinely warm, not performatively polite, which somehow made how she treated me look even worse by comparison. She stumbled through her answers, glancing at me like she was trying to figure out who I actually was, like she'd thought she'd known me for 4 years, and was realizing she'd been completely wrong. Finally, Diane cleared her throat and asked if Brett could come visit too. Of course. I said, "He can take a water taxi whenever he wants." She looked so relieved, immediately pulling out her phone to text him, probably hoping his presence would smooth the whole thing over, or that he could talk me into dropping whatever this was and coming home. She hit send, then looked up at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, part embarrassment, part confusion, part something else I didn't recognize. She opened her mouth and I could see the words forming before she said them. "I didn't know your family was so wealthy. I mean, if I'd known." I held up a hand and she stopped. I told her the money wasn't the point and never had been the point, was she'd been excluding me from family events for 4 years, whether it was a cruise or a lake house weekend or a wine tasting tour. My family's money didn't change the fact that she'd made me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. Her expression shifted from apologetic to defensive and back to something like shame. She glanced past me at the yacht, then back at my face, like she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about me. She started explaining that she'd really thought I preferred my own family, that she was just being considerate. I cut her off and asked directly why Jeremy's 3-month girlfriend counted as more family than Brett's 4-year wife. The question just hung there. I watched her mouth open and close with nothing coming out, watched her look down and start picking at her cuticle. The silence stretched, and I didn't rush to fill it. I just waited while she stared at her hands and came up with nothing. A water taxi rounded the yacht, and Brett climbed out onto our dock, shirt wrinkled, hair like he'd been running his hands through it all day. He crossed the deck and went straight to his mother first, not to me. Looked around wide-eyed, told Diane how incredible the yacht was, how massive, how luxurious. Heat spread through my chest watching him smooth things over with her before he'd even acknowledged what she'd done to me. Still doing it. Still prioritizing her comfort over everything else. Diane grabbed his arm, talking to him quietly, gesturing at me and at the boat. He nodded and put a hand on her shoulder, comforting her. Right then, my brother's girlfriend came up from the lower deck with a drink in hand, only a month into dating him, and yet she walked right over to Diane and Brett with a warm smile, introduced herself, shook their hands, asked about the cruise, genuinely friendly. My brother followed and casually mentioned how glad he was she could join on such short notice, how his family always made new people feel welcome. Diane visibly flinched at that. Her whole body did this little recoil, glancing between my brother's girlfriend and me, clearly running the comparison in real time. Brett finally turned to me and touched my elbow, asked if we could talk privately, something strange in his voice. I nodded and led him to a smaller lounge on the side deck. Before we'd even sat down, he was talking about how embarrassed his family was, how everyone on the ship kept asking about the yacht, how the captain had made announcements. He paced the small space, and I realized he still didn't get why I was upset, entirely focused on his family's embarrassment, not on the fact that his mother had excluded me and he'd let it happen. I told him I hadn't chartered this yacht to embarrass his family. I chartered it because his mother excluded me from a family vacation, and he sat there and let it happen without a word. His hands moved in frustration. In my defense, you could have just talked to me about it instead of making this huge statement. I reminded him I had talked to him about it, and his solution had been suggesting I book a separate room on a different floor. His face shifted. He went quiet for a beat. He admitted the separate room suggestion had been wrong, but then said the yacht was over the top, making everything worse. I asked if he'd have actually stood up to his mother had I just stayed home and accepted the exclusion quietly. He looked away, out at the ocean. I waited. He couldn't answer. Honestly, we both knew he would have just let it slide, like he always did. We stood in silence a moment before I walked back toward the main deck, Brett trailing behind without another word. Back on the main area, I saw Diane talking to my mother near the railing. My mom's expression was polite but strained, the look she got when she strongly disagreed with something but was too well-mannered to argue outright. Diane gestured with her hands, talking fast. My mom caught my eye over her shoulder and gave a subtle head shake, just enough to let me know the conversation wasn't going anywhere good, that Diane was making excuses instead of taking real responsibility. My phone buzzed, a text from Amy asking if she and Porter could come see the yacht too. Surprised she'd reached out directly instead of routing it through Brett or Diane, I texted back that yes, they were welcome. She said they'd grab a water taxi right away. I told Brett his sister was coming. He looked relieved, like maybe Amy's presence would take some of the tension out of the air. About 45 minutes later, another water taxi arrived, Amy climbing out with Porter behind her. She looked around with genuine curiosity, none of Diane's defensiveness, and walked straight over to ask if we could talk for a minute. We moved to a quieter spot near the bow. She took a breath and apologized for not speaking up. When her mom announced the cruise without me, said she'd felt uncomfortable at the time but hadn't wanted to start family drama by confronting Diane, and admitted that was wrong. She should have said something. I appreciated the honesty, even though it didn't undo 4 years of the same pattern. At least she was owning it instead of making excuses. Porter stepped closer and put a hand on Amy's shoulder, looked at me directly and said what Diane did was messed up, and that he'd told her so at the time. Several family members had felt uncomfortable about my exclusion, he said, but nobody wanted to confront Diane, because she gets defensive and makes everything worse. Amy added that her mom has a way of turning any criticism into an attack on her character. We walked back to the main area, where Diane was still talking at my mother, Brett standing nearby, anxious. The dynamic shifted the moment Amy and Porter joined. Diane was mid-explanation when she noticed her daughter approaching. Amy sat down across from her and the conversation paused. My mom excused herself to check on something with the crew. Diane tried to keep going about how cruise ships are actually more fun than yachts, but her voice trailed off with nobody responding. Amy looked at her mother and said, gently, that this wasn't the first time she'd excluded me from family events. Diane's face flushed, and she started to argue, but Amy held up a hand and listed them off: the Vegas reunion, the lake house weekend, the wine tasting tour. Diane got more defensive with each one, insisting there'd been good reasons every time. Brett jumped in to defend her, saying she just had trouble adjusting to new family members. Amy turned to her brother and pointed out I'd been family for 4 years. How long does someone need to be married before they count as real family? He opened his mouth to answer and nothing came out. The fact that his own sister was holding me accountable when he couldn't hit hard. I'd spent years making excuses for Brett, but watching Amy stand up for me when my own husband couldn't made it clear how deep our actual marriage problems ran. This was never just about Diane. It was about Brett choosing his mother's comfort over his wife's dignity. Every single time it counted. Another water taxi pulled up, Jeremy climbing out with Camilla right behind him. Diane stood the moment she saw them. Jeremy looked uncomfortable walking onto the deck. Camilla smiled brightly and waved at everyone. There was this awkward beat where Diane clocked that her son had brought his 3-month girlfriend to see the very yacht she'd excluded her daughter-in-law from. Jeremy went red, mumbled something about Camilla wanting to see the boat. Camilla, seemingly oblivious to any of it, immediately started asking about the helicopter and whether we'd used the submarine yet. My dad appeared and suggested lunch since everyone was there. He signaled the chef, and within minutes the crew had a full spread going on the main deck. We ended up in this surreal scene. Brett's entire family sitting on our yacht eating food from our private chef. Fresh-caught fish, grilled vegetables, some fancy pasta I couldn't pronounce. Conversation was strained, small talk about weather and islands. Brett kept glancing at me nervously, trying to seem normal. My dad watched him carefully from across the table, not saying much, but I knew that look. He was sizing up my husband's character and clearly not liking what he found. My mom asked polite questions about the cruise, Diane answering in clipped sentences. Amy and Porter exchanged the look of two people who'd rather be anywhere else. Jeremy focused on his plate. Camilla kept trying to restart conversations that died fast. Halfway through, Diane made one more attempt to justify herself, said she'd actually been trying to give me a break from family obligations, since I'm always so busy with work. My mother, quiet through most of lunch, finally spoke up. Very politely, she said excluding someone isn't giving them a break, it tells them they don't belong. The table went dead silent. Even Camilla stopped talking. Diane stared at her plate, face reddening again. Brett looked like he wanted to disappear. My dad nodded slightly. Nobody said anything else, and we finished the meal in uncomfortable quiet. After lunch, Diane asked if she could speak to me privately. I agreed, mostly curious what she'd say without Brett there to run interference. We walked to the upper deck, away from everyone, the ocean stretching out in every direction, the cruise ship, a distant shape on the horizon. She stood at the railing a long moment, working up to something. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. She admitted she'd always felt threatened by me, because I'm educated and successful, worried I'd look down on her family for not having degrees or professional careers. I was stunned. I'd never given her any reason to think that. I told her I fell in love with Brett despite our different backgrounds. Not because of them, none of that stuff ever mattered to me. She nodded slowly, said she could see that now. Confessed that seeing the yacht made her realize how much I'd downplayed my family's money all these years, and that she felt foolish for treating me like I was somehow lesser when the truth was so different. I stopped her there. The yacht isn't the issue, I said. The pattern of exclusion is the issue. Money doesn't change the fact that she'd hurt me repeatedly for 4 years. She tried to argue she hadn't meant to hurt me. I cut her off. Intent doesn't matter when the impact's the same. I asked her directly whether she'd have treated me differently from the start if she'd known about my family's money. She hesitated before answering, and that hesitation told me everything. She finally admitted, yes, she probably would have. I told her that's exactly the problem with her values. She'd judged and excluded me based on what she thought I was worth, instead of treating me like family, because that's what I actually am. We walked back down to the main deck, where everyone was still gathered around the table. Diane stood at the head of it and cleared her throat until people looked up. She announced she owed me an apology, and her voice was steady this time, not defensive. She said she'd excluded me from family events over the years and it was wrong, no matter her reasons or my background. She looked right at me when she said it, and I could tell she meant it this time. Brett's whole body relaxed, like someone had cut the strings, holding him up. He smiled at me across the deck, clearly thinking his mother's words had fixed everything between us. But I knew we had bigger problems than just her behavior toward me. I thanked Diane for the apology, told her I appreciated the honesty, then made it clear that rebuilding trust would take time and consistent, changed behavior over months and years. Words were a good start, but actions mattered more. She nodded, didn't argue or make excuses, which was different from how she usually handled being called out. The visit wrapped up soon after, Brett's family needing to get back for dinner on the ship. Amy hugged me tight before leaving, whispered that she was glad I'd stood up for myself, that someone needed to years ago. Porter shook my hand firmly, said he hoped this was a turning point for how the family treated me. Jeremy gave an awkward wave. Camilla smiled without saying much. Brett lingered on the dock, looking back at the yacht like he wanted to stay. Diane thanked my parents for lunch with real politeness, and my dad nodded back with the same courtesy he'd give any guest. I watched their water taxi shrink toward the cruise ship in the distance. My mom came and stood beside me at the railing, didn't say anything, just squeezed my shoulder, and I felt the weight of the whole day settle over me. That evening, my family and I had dinner together at the big table, fresh-caught fish, my siblings talking about jet skiing plans for the next day. My dad waited until everyone had finished eating before asking, directly, what I planned to do about my marriage. The table went quiet, everyone looking at me. I set down my water glass and admitted I didn't know if Brett and I could recover from this, that it had exposed something basic about how he handled conflict and family loyalty. My brother pointed out Brett had had multiple chances to defend me and chose his mother's comfort over my dignity every time it mattered. My mom, more gently, said I deserved a partner who stood beside me, not someone who suggests I book my own room when his family excludes me. My dad listened to all of it, then asked what I wanted to do, not what I thought I should do. I told him honestly, I loved Brett, but I couldn't keep living like this. I needed to see real change over time before I could trust him again. I lay awake in my cabin that night instead of sleeping, the yacht rocking gently, ocean outside the window. I realized the whole situation was just a symptom of something bigger. Brett had never fully separated from his mother's influence in 4 years of marriage, and I'd been accommodating that broken dynamic the entire time without even clocking it. Every time Diane excluded me and Brett made excuses, I told myself it wasn't worth the fight, convinced myself being the bigger person meant accepting less than I deserved. But watching my own family's unconditional support all week showed me what real family actually looked like. My parents had never once made me feel less than, never excluded my partner from anything. They'd welcomed Brett from day one. No conditions, no tests. The contrast was too obvious now to unsee. The next day, Brett texted asking to come back and talk, just the two of us. I agreed after thinking it over. He arrived around noon, looking serious and tired, clearly having spent the past few days thinking hard. We sat in a smaller lounge away from my family. He opened with an apology for not defending me, and for the first time, no excuses, no justifying his mother's behavior. He admitted he'd been conflict avoidant his whole life and it had damaged our marriage. Said he wanted to change but didn't know how. His hands were shaking slightly, and I could see how scared he was of losing me. I told him something important: his mother's apology didn't fix what he'd done. Diane excluded me, but he'd allowed it. He'd even suggested I accommodate the exclusion myself, book a separate room. That betrayal came from my own husband, not my mother-in-law. His face crumpled and he put his head in his hands, broke down, admitted he'd been scared of his mother's disapproval his entire life, that he was only now realizing he'd been sacrificing our marriage to keep her happy. Watching my family's unconditional support that week had shown him how messed up his own family dynamics were. He said he'd never understood what a healthy family relationship looked like until he watched my parents interact with everyone on the yacht. He kept saying sorry, over and over, but I knew sorry wasn't enough to undo years of choosing wrong. I asked what he was willing to do differently. He lifted his head, wiped his eyes, said he wanted to start marriage counseling, set real boundaries with his mother, find a therapist, make sure Diane understood she couldn't treat me like this anymore. I listened, but I'd heard promises before when things got bad. I told him I needed sustained action, not crisis mode promises. He nodded, said he understood, but I could see the hope in his eyes, like he thought this conversation meant we were fine now. We weren't. We sat a while longer, and I told him we both needed space. He should finish the cruise with his family. I'd finish my trip with mine. He looked disappointed, asked if we could at least talk daily. I said no, we needed real time apart, without the pressure of constant contact. He accepted it, though I could tell it hurt. He stood to leave, hesitated at the door, turned back and asked if I was planning to divorce him. The question just hung there, and I realized I didn't have a clean answer. I told him honestly I didn't know yet that I loved him, but couldn't stay in a marriage where I was always second to his mother's feelings. And whether we survived depended entirely on whether he actually did the hard work of changing, not just talked about it. His face crumpled again, but he nodded, and left without trying to hug or kiss me goodbye. I watched the water taxi carry him back to the cruise ship. After he left, I went back to my cabin and lay staring at the ceiling. My mom knocked softly, came in without waiting, sat on the edge of the bed and asked if I was okay. I told her I didn't know if my marriage would survive this. She didn't try to give advice, just squeezed my hand and said whatever I decided, she and Dad would support me. At dinner that night, nobody asked about Brett. My brother made jokes, my dad told old yacht trip stories, everyone acted normal. It felt good to just exist without having to explain or defend anything. The rest of the trip got easier without Brett's family hovering around it. I actually enjoyed the Caribbean for the first time since we'd arrived: snorkeling, sea turtles, a helicopter ride to a tiny island with exactly one restaurant. My parents held hands walking the beach, and I remembered what a healthy marriage was supposed to look like. My brother's girlfriend sat with me one afternoon while we sunbathed and said she admired how I'd handled everything with Diane, that she couldn't imagine being excluded like that and still keeping her composure. It felt good to be around people who included and valued me without thinking twice about it. The contrast with Brett's family was too obvious now. I'd normalized being treated as less than because it had crept in gradually over 4 years. My own family never once made me feel that way, and they'd never made Brett feel that way either. They'd welcomed him completely from the start. On the last day, my dad found me on the upper deck watching the sunrise. We sat quietly a while before he asked if I'd be okay financially if I left Brett. I told him I would. I had my own career, my own savings. He nodded, said he just wanted me making decisions based on what I actually wanted, not what I could afford. I hugged him and thanked him for always having my back. We got home the day after Brett's cruise ended. I went straight to my parents' house instead of the home I shared with him. That evening he texted asking to meet and talk. I thought it over before agreeing to dinner at a neutral restaurant, wanting to see him face to face to gauge whether his promises were real or just panic. We met 3 days later, halfway between our house and my parents. He was already there when I arrived, standing up nervously when he saw me. Over dinner, he pulled out his phone and showed me confirmation emails his first therapy appointment, scheduled for the following week, and a marriage counselor he'd already found and booked our first session with. I was genuinely surprised at how fast he'd followed through. Usually Brett talked about things and never got around to them. He also told me about a conversation he'd had with Diane on the cruise. He'd sat her down and set a clear boundary, treat me with respect or he'd limit contact with her. She hadn't taken it well, he admitted, cried. Said he was choosing me over his family. He'd told her I was his family, and she needed to accept that. Said it was one of the hardest conversations he'd ever had, but he hadn't backed down even when she got upset. Completely new behavior in 4 years. I'd never seen him stand up to her like that. I asked what happened after. Diane barely spoke to him the rest of the cruise. Amy later said she'd spent a lot of time alone in her cabin. He seemed guilty about it, but also proud he'd actually done it. I told him I was willing to try counseling, but he needed to understand I'd need to see sustained change over months, not just an initial burst of effort that faded. I'd seen him make promises before and slide back once things got comfortable. He agreed. Said he understood why I couldn't trust him right away. Then he asked if I was moving back home, and I said not yet. I needed to stay at my parents' place a while longer. He looked hurt but didn't push. Said he respected the boundary and would wait. That alone showed more respect for my needs than years of prior behavior had. We finished dinner and he walked me to my car. Asked if we could do dinner again the following week after his first therapy session. I said yes. Driving back to my parents' house, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not hope exactly, not despair either. Maybe just possibility. Over the following weeks, Brett sent me photos of his therapy, confirmations, and brief updates after sessions, nothing detailed, which I appreciated, since it meant he was actually doing the work instead of performing for me. 3 weeks in, he mentioned his therapist had identified something called enmeshment with his mother, and that he was working on catching himself when he prioritized her feelings over mine. I could see him actually thinking through his responses now instead of just reacting. When Diane called during one of our dinners, he let it go to voicemail instead of jumping to answer like he always used to. Small things, but consistent. Then Diane texted me directly, asking to meet for coffee. I stared at the message a full day before answering. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but I was curious what she'd say without Brett managing the conversation. I agreed to meet halfway between our places. She was already there, sitting at a corner table, fidgeting with a napkin, and stood up looking genuinely nervous when she saw me. We ordered coffee, and she didn't seem to know how to start. Finally, she said she'd been thinking a lot about what happened and wanted to do better. Her voice was shaky, eyes on her hands the whole time. She admitted she'd always felt insecure about not coming from money, and had projected that onto me, assuming I looked down on her family. The yacht situation had forced her to confront her own prejudices for the first time. She'd convinced herself I was the snobby one, when really she'd been the one judging people by money the whole time. It felt real, not rehearsed, and I appreciated the honesty, but I told her rebuilding would take time and consistent, respectful behavior, not one good conversation. She nodded, said she understood, and didn't push for immediate forgiveness or ask when things would go back to normal. More emotional growth than I'd seen from her in 4 years. We finished our coffee, and she asked about meeting again in a few weeks. I said maybe, and left it there. Brett and I started marriage counseling the following week. Our therapist was direct, didn't let either of us dodge. She made him walk through specific examples of choosing his mother's comfort over our marriage, say out loud that he'd suggested I book a separate room instead of standing up for me. Hearing himself repeat it back seemed to land differently than when I'd said it. She helped him see how his conflict avoidance with Diane had enabled her behavior and hurt our marriage. She also called me out for downplaying my family's wealth to avoid conflict, which I hadn't expected. Hiding parts of myself to keep others comfortable, she said, was its own kind of dishonesty. We both had work ahead of us. Brett kept up with his individual therapy, actually did the homework, started catching patterns in real time, sometimes stopping mid-sentence when he noticed himself about to prioritize his mom's feelings. Not perfect, but genuine effort. 3 months after the Caribbean trip, we were in a better place, still moving carefully. He held his boundaries with Diane even when she tested them. She called crying one night over something minor, and instead of staying on the phone for hours trying to fix her feelings the way old Brett would have, he told her he'd talk to her the next day when she'd calmed down and hung up. I watched it happen from across the room and felt something shift. He wasn't just promising anymore, he was actually doing it, consistently. Over the following months, my trust rebuilt in small pieces. Amy texted asking to grab lunch and I said yes. We met near her work, and she apologized again for not speaking up sooner about her mother's treatment of me, said watching me stand up for myself on the yacht had pushed her to set her own boundaries with Diane. She told her mom she wasn't available for daily phone calls anymore and needed advance notice for family events instead of last-minute demands. Their relationship was actually improving, she said, because Diane respected her more now that she had boundaries. I told Amy I was glad, but it was hard not to feel a little bitter that it took me chartering a yacht for anyone in Brett's family to notice the problem. She said she knew, and she was sorry it took something so dramatic. Then Diane called me directly, not Brett, to invite me to a family dinner, explicitly asking me first before even mentioning it to him, checking whether the following Saturday worked before finalizing anything. Small thing, but it showed a real shift in how she thought about inclusion. I told her Saturday worked, and she sounded relieved. The dinner was still a little awkward, but better. Diane introduced me to extended family. I'd never met cousins and aunts, apparently living nearby, who'd somehow never been at events I'd attended, and made a point of talking up my accomplishments in our marriage, telling her sister we'd just hit our 5th anniversary and that I had an amazing career. Brett squeezed my hand under the table, visibly proud of his mother's effort. It wasn't perfect, and I stayed guarded, but the change was real and visible. Afterward, Brett and I took a weekend trip together, just the two of us, up the coast to a small inn with an ocean view. We didn't talk about his family, the yacht, or therapy, just walked the beach, had long dinners, remembered what it felt like to just be us, without all the drama. He was more attentive than he'd been in years, actually listening when I talked about work instead of waiting for his turn, reaching for my hand while we walked without it feeling like he was trying to fix anything. It just felt natural. One night on the balcony, watching the sunset, he said he was grateful I hadn't given up on us. I told him I'd almost had. He said he knew, and he didn't blame me. We sat there quietly, and I remembered exactly why I'd fallen for him in the first place before his mother's behavior and his inability to stand up to her had built this wall between us. 6 months later, I started packing to move back into our house. Brett helped carry boxes from my apartment, and we worked together quietly, and it felt different from before. He'd been showing up consistently, calling when he said he would, standing up to Diane when she overstepped. The first night back in our bedroom felt strange, but right, like we were building something new instead of returning to what had broken. He defended our marriage to his mother 3 separate times in the past month alone, told her clearly that my needs came first. We still had hard conversations, but he didn't shut down or make excuses anymore. 2 weeks after I moved back, Diane called me directly again, asking if I had any date preferences for a family weekend at the lake house. I nearly dropped my phone. She wanted my input before finalizing anything, checked my schedule, asked what activities I'd enjoy. I mentioned mid-June, said I liked kayaking, and she wrote it all down, said she'd plan around what worked for me. When the weekend came, I felt genuinely welcomed instead of tolerated. Diane introduced me to her lake house neighbors as her daughter-in-law, with real pride in her voice, asked my opinion on dinner plans, included me naturally in conversation, and it mattered more than I expected. Brett noticed me relaxing over the weekend and squeezed my hand while we sat on the dock. A month later, my parents invited both families to dinner at our house, and I was nervous about how it would go. Diane arrived early with flowers, warm and respectful with my mother, asking about her garden and actually listening to the answers. My dad and Brett's father talked golf while Brett stood beside me, relaxed instead of tense, not managing anyone's feelings or smoothing over awkward moments, just present. Amy helped me set the table and whispered she'd never seen her mother this at ease around my family. Watching both families laugh together over dessert, I could see exactly how far we'd come. For our 5th anniversary, Brett planned a quiet trip to a bed and breakfast in wine country. 3 days walking through vineyards, long dinners. On the last night, he gave me a necklace with both our family's birthstones twisted together in the design, told me he was grateful I hadn't given up on us when leaving, would have been so much easier. Holding that necklace, I realized standing up for myself on that yacht had saved our marriage instead of ending it, and that sometimes the hardest thing and the right thing turn out to be exactly the same. And that's the wrap-up. I always try to leave something real to take away from each story. If this one gave you even a small idea, that's a win.